A black teen went missing from Death Valley. 1 year later, rangers found something shocking. The desert has a way of swallowing secrets whole, and Malcolm Hayes was about to become one of them. It was 6:47 a.m. when Malcolm's mother Diane first felt the cold grip of panic. Her 17-year-old son should have been back from his photography trip by now. Malcolm wasn't the type to break promises, especially not to his mom. He'd said 3 days, maybe 4 at most, to capture the sunrise over Death Valley's most remote corners. That was 6 days ago. He's probably just found the perfect shot and lost track of time, Diane whispered to herself, but her hands trembled as she dialed the park service. Deep down, mothers always know when something's wrong. Veteran Ranger Eli Carver was finishing his morning coffee when the call came through. 23 years patrolling Death Valley had taught him to read between the lines of worried parent calls. This one was different. The mother wasn't hysterical or demanding, she was terrified in that quiet, bone-deep way that meant real trouble. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly where your son was planning to photograph?" Carver's weathered voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too much desert claim too many lives. He mentioned something about the backcountry areas, places tourists don't usually go. He wanted to capture the real Death Valley, he said. Not the postcard version. Diane's voice cracked on the last word. Carver felt his stomach tighten. The backcountry wasn't forgiving to experienced hikers, let alone a teenager with a camera and big dreams. Within an hour, he'd assembled a search team that would grow to include dozens of rangers, volunteers, and even a helicopter crew donated by a local news station that caught wind of the story. Malcolm Hayes wasn't just any missing person. The local news painted him as the kind of kid who gave people hope, honor roll student, community volunteer, and a photographer whose Instagram account showcased a maturity beyond his years. His pictures revealed an artist's eye for finding beauty in harsh places. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Death Valley might become his final canvas. For 2 weeks, Carver led the most intensive search in the park's recent history. They combed through narrow canyons where the temperature could finish in hours, searched abandoned mine shafts that dotted the landscape like deadly puzzles, and followed every wash and ridge where a disoriented hiker might seek shelter. The breakthrough came on day 16 when a volunteer spotted something blue wedged against a boulder in a dried-out wash about 8 miles from where Malcolm had parked his car. It was his backpack, faded denim blue with patches from national parks he visited. Inside, they found his wallet, some energy bars, and a notebook filled with location scouting notes written in his careful handwriting. But what they didn't find made Carver's blood run cold. Malcolm's phone, his expensive camera equipment, and most critically, his water bottles were gone. In Death Valley, water meant life. No experienced hiker would abandon their water supply unless something terrible had happened. Could be animals scattered his gear, suggested Deputy Rangers Martinez, but even she didn't sound convinced. Maybe he dropped the pack running from something. Carver studied the scene with eyes that had witnessed dozens of desert tragedies. Something felt wrong about the whole setup. The backpack was positioned too neatly, almost like it had been placed rather than dropped in panic. The surrounding area showed no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no blood. It was as if Malcolm had simply vanished into the desert air, leaving behind only what someone wanted them to find. The rumors started on day 20. Death Valley had a way of breeding whispers, and Malcolm's disappearance fed every dark theory the locals had been harboring for years. Some said he'd been taken by the desert's hidden predators, not just coyotes or mountain lions, but human predators who knew these remote areas better than any ranger. Others whispered about drug runners using the backcountry as their highway, eliminating witnesses without a second thought. The most disturbing rumors came from the old-timers who'd lived near the park for decades. They spoke in hushed tones about young people who'd gone missing over the years, always in the same general area, always during the brutal summer months when the heat could excuse any death. They mentioned names that never made the newspapers, faces that family members still searched for in crowds years later. Carver found himself working 18-hour days, pushing his team beyond reasonable limits. His wife started leaving dinner plates covered in the refrigerator, knowing he wouldn't be home until well past midnight. Sleep became something he grabbed in 2-hour chunks between search operations. On day 28, park officials made the decision that Carver had been dreading. The search was officially called off. Malcolm Hayes would join the tragic statistics of people swallowed by America's national parks, present in missing person databases but absent from the world. But what happened next shocked everyone who knew Eli Carver. 3 days after the search ended, Carver walked into Park Superintendent Morrison's office and submitted his retirement papers. No explanation, no gradual transition, no farewell ceremony for a man who dedicated more than 2 decades to protecting Death Valley's visitors. "Eli, what's this about?" Morrison had asked, holding the paperwork like it might bite him. "You've got 4 more years until full pension. This doesn't make sense." Carver's response would haunt Morrison for months afterward. The veteran ranger looked him straight in the eye and said, "Some things in this desert are better left buried, Tom. I'm done digging." Morrison tried to press for details, but Carver had already cleaned out his desk and turned in his badge. By sunset, the man who led Death Valley's most intensive search operation in years was driving away from the park for the last time, leaving behind more questions than answers. Diane Hayes attended Carver's retirement ceremony, hoping to thank the man who'd searched so hard for her boy. But there was no ceremony. Eli Carver had simply disappeared from their lives as completely as Malcolm had vanished into the desert. The official report listed Malcolm Hayes as a probable heat exposure victim, his body likely claimed by the desert's vast network of hidden canyons and underground caverns. Case closed, file sealed, family left to wonder. But in the ranger station's quiet moments, when the wind howled through Death Valley's endless spaces, the remaining staff couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been told only part of the story. Carver's sudden departure felt less like retirement and more like escape. And sometimes, late at night when the park was empty except for the sounds of the desert, they wondered what secrets their colleague had taken with him into his silence. 1 year later, Death Valley welcomed its newest class of ranger recruits with the kind of scorching August heat that reminded everyone why this place earned its name. Among them was Tessa Morales, a 26-year-old former geology student whose enthusiasm for the job hadn't yet been beaten down by the desert's harsh realities. "Rookies always think they're going to change everything," muttered Senior Ranger Bill Hendricks as he watched Tessa studying topographical maps with the intensity of someone planning a military operation. "Give her 6 months of pulling tourists out of slot canyons and she'll settle down." But Tessa wasn't like the typical recruits. She had a restless curiosity that made her question why certain areas of their assigned territory were marked with outdated information, why some canyons had been surveyed decades ago and never revisited, and most intriguingly, why several remote areas were marked restricted access, without any clear explanation in the current files. "These maps are ancient," she told her training partner, Jake Chin, holding up a survey chart dated 1987. "How are we supposed to help people navigate safely when we're working with Reagan-era information?" Jake, who'd been on the job for 3 months and already considered himself a Death Valley veteran, shrugged. "The desert doesn't change much, Morales. Rock formations don't exactly grow legs and walk away." That attitude would have been enough to discourage most people, but Tessa had spent her college years studying geological formations that shifted and evolved over time. She knew that even the most permanent-looking landscapes held secrets, and Death Valley was famous for hiding its mysteries in plain sight. The opportunity came during their 3rd week of training. Supervisor Morrison had assigned the rookie class to update the park's digital mapping system, a tedious project that involved cross-referencing old paper maps with GPS coordinates and current satellite imagery. It was the kind of busy work designed to keep new rangers occupied while they learned the basics. "Take the northern backcountry sections," Morrison told them, handing over a stack of weathered maps. "Focus on the areas marked for restricted access. Make sure our databases match the actual restrictions and that we have current photos for the safety briefings." Tessa grabbed the assignments eagerly, but as she studied the maps that night in her small ranger housing unit, something caught her attention. Several of the restricted areas had been marked personally by E. Carver, with dates spanning the last 5 years of his service. The handwriting was distinctive, careful, precise, almost obsessive in its detail. What struck her most was that many of these restrictions seemed arbitrary. Unlike the marked areas around dangerous mine shafts or unstable rock formations, these zones appeared to encompass perfectly normal canyon systems with no obvious hazards noted in the files. Why would someone restrict access to these areas? She wondered aloud, tracing the boundaries with her finger. There's no mention of archaeological sites, no environmental concerns, no recorded accidents. The next morning, Tessa convinced Jake and 2 other recruits to help her with what she called field verification of the restricted zones. Morrison had encouraged them to be thorough, after all. The canyon system they chose was about 15 miles northeast of the main visitor area, marked on the maps as Restricted E. Carver 2019 access prohibited. The designation was recent enough that it should have clear documentation, but when Tessa had searched the digital files, she found only a brief notation. Area secured pending further evaluation. The hike took them through increasingly remote terrain, following a narrow wash that wound between towering rock walls painted in layers of geological time. The beauty of the place was undeniable, exactly the kind of hidden gem that photographers like Malcolm Hayes would have been drawn to. I don't see anything dangerous here, Jake panted as they climbed over a small boulder field. Maybe Carver was just being extra cautious. But when they reached the area marked as restricted, they found something that made Tessa's blood run cold. The canyon entrance had been partially sealed with rocks and marked with official, no entry, signs, but recent flash floods had washed away some of the barriers, creating a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Should we really be doing this? Asked Maria Santos, one of the other recruits. If there's a reason it's restricted. Tessa was already pulling on her flashlight and safety gear. We're park rangers. It's our job to know why places are dangerous so we can keep people safe. How can we do that if we don't know what we're protecting them from? Inside the canyon, their flashlight beams revealed something that shouldn't have been there. Scattered across the sandy floor were pieces of torn fabric, faded but recognizable as outdoor gear. Near a fallen boulder, Jake spotted something metallic glinting in the sand. Is that? Maria's voice trailed off as Tessa carefully picked up a dusty camera lens, expensive and professional grade. But it was Tessa who made the discovery that would change everything. Half buried in the sand near the canyon wall, she found a small pendant on a broken chain. The silver was tarnished, but the engraving was still clearly visible. M.H. Malcolm Hayes? Tessa whispered, the name hitting her like a physical blow. She'd read about the missing photographer during her orientation training, studied his case as an example of how quickly the desert could claim lives. The implications crashed over them like a flash flood. These items, the lens, the clothing, the pendant, they'd never been reported as found. According to every official record, Malcolm Hayes's camera equipment and personal effects had vanished with him, never to be recovered. So why were they here, in a canyon that Eli Carver had personally sealed off just months after Malcolm's disappearance? Jake was the first to voice what they were all thinking. Carver knew about this place. He knew about these things, and he never told anyone. The question that hung in the desert air like heat shimmer was simple and terrifying. Why would a veteran ranger hide evidence in a missing person case? As they carefully photographed and documented their find, none of them realized they were about to uncover a pattern that stretched back decades. A trail of disappearances and cover-ups that would shake Death Valley's ranger service to its core. Sleep didn't come easy for Tessa Morales that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Malcolm's pendant glinting in her flashlight beam, heard the echo of her own voice whispering his initials in that hidden canyon. By 4 a.m., she gave up trying to rest and made her way to the ranger station's archive room. The Death Valley archives were a testament to bureaucratic neglect. Filing cabinets that hadn't been properly organized since the Clinton administration, boxes of field reports stacked haphazardly on metal shelves, and computer records that existed in 3 different systems depending on when they'd been digitized. Tessa started with Malcolm Hayes's official file, comparing every detail against what they'd found in the canyon. The discrepancies began appearing immediately. Carver's initial field report, dated just 2 days into the search, stated, No personal effects recovered beyond backpack. All other items including camera equipment, phone, and jewelry presumed lost or destroyed by environmental factors. But there was something else, a handwritten notation in the margin that made Tessa's hands shake. Items secured for family EC. The notation was dated 3 days after the official report claimed nothing else had been found. Secured for family? Tessa muttered, cross-referencing with the evidence logs. No items beyond the backpack had ever been returned to Malcolm's mother. She'd read the newspaper interviews where Diane Hayes tearfully mentioned never getting her son's camera back, never having anything of his to hold on to except that empty backpack. Diving deeper into Carver's search reports, Tessa found more inconsistencies. His daily field reports, the ones filed directly with park headquarters, painted a picture of thorough, methodical searching. But copies of the same reports filed with the county sheriff's office told a different story. Entire search areas were described differently, coordinates didn't match, and timeline discrepancies suggested Carver had been searching areas he never officially reported. Why would he submit different reports to different agencies? Tessa wondered, but the answer was starting to form in her mind. Someone submitting conflicting reports was either incredibly disorganized or deliberately hiding something. The breakthrough came when she found a misfiled folder wedged between budget reports from 1994 and 1996. The tab read, A. Willis Missing Person 1995. Her heart started racing as she opened it. Andre Willis, 17 years old. Black teenager from Las Vegas who'd gone missing during a family camping trip to Death Valley in July 1995. The similarities to Malcolm's case were chilling. A young man who'd wandered away from his family's campsite in the backcountry, a massive search effort that found only scattered personal belongings, and no body ever recovered. But what made Tessa's blood run cold was the lead investigator's signature on every report, Ranger E. Carver. The file contained the same pattern she'd noticed in Malcolm's case. Conflicting reports, mysterious gaps in the search timeline, and personal effects that were listed as never recovered in the official documents but marked as secured in Carver's handwritten notes. At the bottom of Andre's file, she found something that made her question everything she thought she knew about Eli Carver. It was a journal entry, photocopied and attached to the case file, written in what appeared to be Carver's own handwriting. July 23, 1995 found more evidence in the Northern Canyon system. Coordinates 36.4892 degrees north, 116.7331 degrees west. Items suggest Andre made it further than initially believed. Unable to proceed with full recovery due to complications. Area requires long-term monitoring. Tessa grabbed her phone and plugged the coordinates into her GPS app. Her hands trembled as she realized those coordinates marked the exact location where they'd found Malcolm's belongings. The canyon Carver had restricted access to just months after Malcolm's disappearance. 30 years apart, she whispered. 2 black teenagers. Same area. Same investigating ranger. The implications were staggering. Either Eli Carver was the unluckiest ranger in Death Valley history, repeatedly assigned to investigate similar cases in the same cursed location, or something far more sinister was happening. Tessa spent the rest of the night building a timeline. Andre Willis in 1995. A gap of nearly 3 decades. Then Malcolm Hayes in 2023. Both cases involved teenagers who'd vanished during peak heat season. Both had extensive searches that turned up minimal evidence, and both had been personally handled by Carver with apparent cover-ups following. But there was something else that made her stomach churn. In Andre's file, she found a list of other missing persons cases in Death Valley going back to the 1980s. Most were adults, tourists who'd gotten lost or fell victim to the harsh environment. But scattered throughout the decades were other cases, young people, often minorities, whose disappearances followed similar patterns. The pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. As dawn broke over Death Valley, Tessa sat surrounded by decades of files, her mind reeling with the scope of what she'd uncovered. Eli Carver hadn't just been covering up 2 cases. He'd been the common thread in a web of disappearances that stretched back to the beginning of his career. The question that terrified her most wasn't what had happened to Malcolm Hayes and Andre Willis. It was how many others there had been, and whether Carver had been protecting them or silencing them. Either way, she was now holding evidence that could destroy the reputation of Death Valley's most respected ranger, and possibly expose something much darker lurking in the desert's hidden places. Eli Carver's retirement home sat on the outskirts of Beatty, Nevada, a modest ranch-style house that looked like it had been built to disappear into the desert landscape. Tessa sat in her patrol car for 10 minutes, watching the windows for signs of life, rehearsing what she would say to the man who might hold the key to decades of missing persons cases. The front door opened before she could knock. Carver stood there, looking older than his 62 years, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of too many years squinting into the desert sun. But his eyes were sharp, alert, the eyes of someone who'd been expecting this visit. "Ranger Morales," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she'd hoped for. "I wondered when someone would come asking questions. Mr. Carver, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to meet you properly. Heard so much about your service to the park." Tessa kept her tone light, friendly, but she could see he wasn't buying the casual retirement visit act. "Come in then," he said, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "Coffee's fresh." The living room was sparse, functional, a man's space with no personal touches except for a single framed photograph on the mantel. It showed a younger Carver in uniform, arms crossed, standing in front of a Park Service vehicle. But what caught Tessa's attention was what wasn't there. No awards, no commendation photos, no mementos from over 2 decades of service. It was as if Eli Carver had tried to erase his ranger career from his retirement. "So," Carver said, settling into a worn leather chair, "what brings a rookie ranger to my door? Can't be just friendly conversation." Tessa decided to start small, test the waters. "I've been working on updating some of the park maps, and I noticed you'd restricted access to several areas. I was hoping to understand the reasoning, make sure we're keeping visitors safe." The change in Carver's demeanor was immediate. His jaw tightened, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Which areas?" "The Northern Canyon systems, mostly. Some beautiful spots that seem like they'd be popular with photographers and hikers. I was curious about the restrictions. Some places are better left alone," Carver said, his voice flat. "The desert has its own rules, and smart people learn to respect them," Tessa pressed gently. "I'm just trying to understand the specific dangers. For the safety briefings, you know? Was it unstable rock formations? Wildlife concerns? You wouldn't understand." Carver snapped, then caught himself, forcing his voice back to neutral. "You're new. You haven't seen what this place can do to people who don't show proper respect. Like Malcolm Hayes?" The name hit Carver like a physical blow. He went completely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. For a long moment, the only sound was the desert wind rattling the windows. "That boy was a tragedy," Carver finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Smart kid, good family. The desert took him, just like it's taken too many others. But you found more than just his backpack, didn't you?" Carver's cup shattered against the floor, coffee spreading across the hardwood like spilled blood. "I think you should leave. Mr. Carver, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to understand." "You don't understand anything," Carver exploded, rising from his chair. "You think you can walk into this desert with your fresh training and your digital maps and figure out mysteries that have been buried for good reason? Some stones are better left unturned, Ranger Morales." Tessa stood her ground, even as every instinct told her to run. "What happened to Andre Willis?" The question stopped Carver cold. His face went pale, and for a moment she thought he might collapse. "How do you know that name?" "I found his file. Same pattern as Malcolm. Same investigating ranger. Same restricted area." Carver moved to the window, staring out at the desert that had defined his career. "Andre Willis was a long time ago. Ancient history. Not so ancient that you forgot to seal off the canyon where he died. I never said he died in that canyon." The slip was subtle, but Tessa caught it. Then where did he die, Mr. Carver? But Carver had already shut down, his face becoming a mask of stubborn silence. I think our conversation is over. You should go back to your maps and your safety briefings and leave the past where it belongs. Tessa left her card on the table despite his obvious dismissal. If you change your mind, if you want to help these families find closure. Some families are better off not knowing, Carver said without turning around. Trust me on that. That night, Tessa barely slept. She kept replaying Carver's words, his reactions, the way he'd seemed to know exactly why she was there before she'd even explained. Around 3 a.m., she heard something slide under her door, the soft whisper of paper against hardwood. There was no one in the hallway when she opened the door, just an unmarked manila envelope lying on the threshold. Inside, she found a collection of photographic negatives, old and slightly yellowed with age. A note, written in block letters, simply said, "He's been lying for 30 years. Tessa held the negatives up to the light, squinting to make out the images. Most were too dark or blurry to distinguish, but one made her blood run cold. It showed a young man in a Park Service uniform, clearly Eli Carver, decades younger, standing next to a black teenager in hiking gear. The teenager was smiling, alive, apparently unharmed. She grabbed her phone and searched for Andre Willis's missing person photo online. The face matched perfectly. The photograph proved what Carver had denied. He had met Andre Willis, interacted with him, possibly even been the last person to see him alive. But the official report stated that Andre had disappeared before any park personnel made contact. Tessa sank into her chair, the implications crashing over her. If Carver had lied about meeting Andre, what else had he lied about? And who had taken this photograph? Who had kept it hidden for 30 years, only to reveal it now? Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or you'll end up like them." As dawn broke over Death Valley, Tessa realized she was no longer just investigating a cold case. She was walking into a conspiracy that someone was willing to finish to protect, and she might already be too deep to turn back. The warning from her superiors came swift and direct. Superintendent Morrison called Tessa into his office the morning after her visit to Carver, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by something colder, more bureaucratic. "Ranger Morales, I understand you've been conducting some unofficial investigations," Morrison said, not inviting her to sit. "I need you to understand that pursuing dead-end cases from decades past isn't part of your job description. Sir, I've uncovered evidence that suggests." "You've uncovered nothing but old paperwork and coincidences." Morrison cut her off. "Eli Carver was one of our finest rangers, and I won't have his reputation tarnished by a rookie looking to make her mark. Drop this, Tessa. For your own good." The phrase echoed the anonymous text message, and Tessa felt a chill run down her spine. How many people were involved in keeping these secrets buried? But warnings had never been effective at stopping Tessa Morales. If anything, they only confirmed she was on the right track. 2 nights later, she convinced Jake Chen to join her for what she called advanced night navigation training. The thermal drone they borrowed from the equipment bay was officially for wildlife monitoring, but Tessa had other plans. "I still think this is a bad idea," Jake whispered as they hiked through the restricted canyon under cover of darkness. "If Morrison finds out we're here, then we better make sure we find something worth the risk," Tessa replied, programming the drone's flight path. The thermal imaging revealed what their daylight investigation had missed. Behind the main canyon wall, hidden by a natural rock formation, the drone detected a temperature differential that suggested open space, a cave system that wasn't visible from ground level. "There," Tessa pointed to her tablet screen. "The cave entrance is about 50 feet up that rock face. Looks like there's a narrow ledge leading to it." The climb was treacherous in the dark, but Tessa's rock climbing experience from college served her well. Jake followed reluctantly, muttering prayers under his breath as loose rocks skittered down into the darkness below. The cave entrance was partially blocked by a rusted metal gate that looked like it had been installed decades ago. The lock was old, corroded by desert weather, and gave way after Jake applied a crowbar they brought for emergency equipment testing. Inside, their flashlight beams revealed a horror that neither of them had been prepared for. The cave system was larger than they'd expected, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. In the first chamber, they found an old Park Service jacket hanging from a makeshift hook, the name tag reading, E. Carver, in faded letters. But it was the second chamber that made them both gasp in shock. Scattered across the floor were human remains, bones that had been there long enough to be picked clean by desert scavengers but were clearly arranged with deliberate care. Someone had been using this place as a burial ground. Jesus Christ! Jake breathed, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hands. Near the bones, they found a collection of water-stained journals wrapped in plastic. Tessa opened the first one with shaking hands, recognizing Carver's handwriting immediately. July 1995. They have Andre. The same people who've been using the northern routes for their business. They want me to keep the search focused on the southern canyons, away from their operation. They showed me photos of what they'll do if I don't cooperate. Tessa's blood ran cold as she continued reading. August 1995 found Andre's body in the cave. They made it look like exposure, but I can see the trauma. I can't report this without exposing their whole network. They have photos of me taking money, evidence they've manufactured. I'm trapped. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The journal entries painted a picture of a young ranger who'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a missing person case. The desert's remote canyons were being used as a highway for trafficking, and when Andre Willis had wandered into the wrong area at the wrong time, he'd become a witness who couldn't be allowed to survive. September 1995 sealed the cave. Told them it was to protect their operation, but really it's to protect Andre. He deserves better than being left for the animals. I've become their gatekeeper, and I hate myself for it. The final entry that Tessa could make out was dated just months before Malcolm's disappearance. June 2023. They're active again. Same routes, same threats. The Hayes boy was asking questions about the restricted areas, taking pictures. I tried to steer him away, but he's stubborn like Andre was. God help me, I know what's coming. Jake was examining something in the corner of the cave. Tessa, you need to see this. He was holding a camera, expensive, professional grade, with Nim Hayes engraved on the strap. Inside the memory card slot, they found dozens of photos. Most were landscape shots, but the final images on the card made everything clear. Malcolm had photographed vehicles in the desert, people moving cargo at night, license plates, faces. He'd stumbled onto the same trafficking operation that had finished Andre Willis 30 years earlier. And just like Andre, Malcolm had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. Carver tried to protect him. Tessa whispered, understanding finally dawning. That's why he retired so suddenly. He knew what was coming, and he couldn't stop it again. The sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the canyon, their engines growing louder by the second. Someone had been watching, waiting for them to find the cave. We need to go, Jake said, grabbing the journals. Now. But as they reached the cave entrance, flashlight beams cut through the darkness below. They were surrounded, trapped in the same cave that had become Andre Willis's tomb 30 years ago. In the distance, Tessa could hear voices organizing a search of the canyon walls. The people who had silenced 2 teenagers and corrupted a park ranger were coming to tie up the last loose ends. The whisper trail had led them to the truth, but it might also have led them to their deaths. The rescue came from an unexpected source. Jake had managed to activate an emergency beacon on his radio before they'd entered the cave, a standard safety protocol that saved their lives when Park Service backup arrived just as the traffickers were scaling the canyon walls. The firefight in the desert lasted less than 10 minutes, but it shattered 30 years of carefully maintained silence. When the dust settled, 3 members of a trafficking network were in custody, and the evidence Tessa and Jake had recovered painted a picture of corruption that reached far beyond Death Valley's borders. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. The FBI's trafficking task force descended on the park with the efficiency of a military operation, following the trails that Malcolm's photographs and Carver's journals had revealed. Within days, they'd uncovered a network that had been using Death Valley's remote canyons as a smuggling route for decades, moving people and drugs through terrain so harsh that even experienced law enforcement rarely patrolled it. But for Eli Carver, the revelation came too late for redemption. 2 days after the cave discovery made national headlines, Tessa received a call that sent her racing to the Beatty Medical Center. Carver had collapsed at his home, a massive stroke that the doctors said was likely triggered by stress and the weight of secrets, finally coming to light. She found him barely conscious, his weathered hands clutching a sealed envelope that he pressed into her palm with the last of his strength. "Tell them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the beeping monitors. "Tell them I tried to save the boy. Both boys. I tried." Eli Carver died that afternoon, taking his detailed knowledge of the trafficking network with him but leaving behind a confession that would finally bring justice to families who had waited decades for answers. The letter Tessa found in his final envelope was 11 pages of handwritten anguish, a complete account of how a young park ranger had stumbled onto a criminal operation and been systematically destroyed by his inability to stop it. "I was 28 when I found Andre Willis," the letter began. "Not much older than Miss Morales is now, and just as determined to do the right thing. They showed me photographs of Andre's final hours, what they'd done to him for taking pictures of their operation. Then they showed me photographs of my own family, my wife, my daughter. The choice wasn't really a choice at all." The letter detailed how the trafficking network had used legitimate Park Service restrictions to protect their routes, how they'd forced Carver to file false reports and misdirect searches, how they'd used his own sense of duty against him by threatening innocent lives. "I became their gatekeeper," Carver wrote. "Every time someone got too close to their operation, I had to find ways to steer them away. When that failed, when people like Andre and Malcolm saw too much, I couldn't protect them. The guilt has eaten at me for 30 years, but I told myself that keeping silent was better than letting them hurt more people." The confession provided the FBI with detailed information about the network's operations, leading to arrests across 3 states and the recovery of other victims who had disappeared over the decades. The scope of the operation was staggering. Dozens of people had vanished into the desert's hidden places, their families left to wonder and grieve without closure. The forensic examination of the cave confirmed what Carver's journals had revealed. Andre Willis's remains were formally identified through DNA testing, finally giving his family the closure they'd sought for 30 years. The evidence suggested he'd been held in the cave for several days before being finished, and that Carver had indeed tried to negotiate for his release. Malcolm Hayes's body was never recovered, but DNA evidence in the cave confirmed he'd been there. His mother, Diane, found some peace in finally understanding what had happened to her son and why. The photographs on Malcolm's camera became crucial evidence in dismantling the trafficking network, ensuring that his artistic eye for detail served justice even in death. The Park Service launched a comprehensive review of all missing person cases dating back to the 1980s, uncovering a pattern of disappearances that had been hidden by the network's ability to exploit the desert's reputation for claiming lives. Superintendent Morrison was placed on administrative leave pending investigation into how much he'd known about Carver's compromised position. 6 months after the cave discovery, Death Valley held its first annual Missing Persons Awareness Day. Tessa, now promoted to lead the park's new cold case review unit, stood before a memorial wall bearing photographs of Andre Willis, Malcolm Hayes, and 7 other victims whose cases had finally been solved. These young people came to Death Valley seeking beauty, adventure, and inspiration, she told the gathered families and media. Instead, they found predators who counted on this desert's reputation for swallowing secrets. But secrets have a way of surfacing eventually, and their courage in documenting what they saw helped us ensure that no one else will suffer the same fate. The canyon where Andre and Malcolm had been taken was renamed Willis Hayes Memorial Canyon, its trails now marked with educational displays about recognizing trafficking and reporting suspicious activity. The area that had once been restricted to hide crimes was now open to the public, its dark history transformed into a beacon for awareness and prevention. Diane Hayes spoke at the memorial dedication, her voice strong despite her tears. Malcolm always said he wanted his photographs to tell important stories. I never imagined his final pictures would help save other families from going through what we did. That's the legacy I choose to remember, not how he died, but how his life and courage made a difference. As the sun set over Death Valley that day, painting the desert in the golden light that had drawn photographers like Malcolm to its harsh beauty, Tessa reflected on how truth had a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it. The desert had kept its secrets for 30 years, but in the end, it had also preserved the evidence needed to bring justice. Some stories, she realized, were too important to stay buried in the sand.